Hey. Hey, Sean. Welcome. If you can hear me, good, because I'm not sure if you can. I'm just going with some stuff here. Once again, streaming video on the iPhone while trying to monitor audio is impossible. So I just sort of have to hook up microphones, plug them in, and hope for the best. I see a green light on this microphone, which means it understands that there's something it's connected to. But hi, Maya. Good to see you. My dog is here. Tonight, what I wanted to talk about was my next camera. And so I'm streaming from my phone here. But my main camera is just hook this guy. So my main camera for all things video production is the Sony a7S III, and I have the Polar Pro matte box on here, which I typically have on here, and I really like. But this is just the a7S III with the 24-70 G Master Generation 1 zoom lens f2.8. And this is a killer setup. This is what gets me through most of my work. Before this camera, I had the a7 III as my primary camera. And before that, I had the a7S II as my primary camera. Before that, I had the a6500 crop sensor, APS-C, as my primary camera. And each time that I get a new camera, I upgrade and my A camera becomes my B camera. And this is sort of the process that's been going for a long time. I used to have a Canon 5D Mark II as my main camera, and then I got a Canon 80D as my B camera, and that was a good setup for a while, and then I switched to Sony. My first camera was the a6500 crop sensor, and after I quickly fell in love with Sony and what they were doing with video at the time, I switched and did the full-on Sony a7S II, which was a great A cam, and looking back on how they've iterated and innovated since then, it's been really cool to see. It's interesting to look back and be like, that was my main camera. Like now it's not unusable, but it's like, I don't know how I could go back to an a7S II now that I'm used to the autofocus of the a7 III and the a7S III, and the a7 IV and the a1 and the a9 II and the FX3 and the FX6. And that's what we're talking about tonight. So I'm in this spot where this is my only camera body. I sold my a7S III before the a7S. I'm sorry. This is so confusing because of the names. I sold my a7 III, which was my B cam. I sold that before the a7 IV came out because I wanted to get the most for it, and I wasn't shooting a lot, so it wasn't really worth it to me to make this happen. Hey, Maya. 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 Come on. Upstairs. Upstairs. Go. Go. Sorry about that. Dog roaming the basement isn't always the best thing. So I sold my a7 III before the a7 IV came out because I was anticipating buying the a7 IV as soon as it came out and wanting to get the most money for my a7 III before that happened. And it sort of happened where I started shooting a little differently right as that happened. And since then, it's been almost a year now, I've only had one camera body. And so I've been waiting to say, which camera body am I going to get? What is going to be my next camera body, my B camera, or is the a7S III going to be my B cam? And what is my new A cam going to be? And I've got several options and a few reasons why and why not for each of them. And then I've decided, I think, as of today, which direction I'm actually going. I'm going to share that at the end here. But I'm going to walk through each of them quickly and say sort of why not, what they've got going for them and what they don't. So with the a7S III as my baseline, I love this camera. I love that it shoots full frame 4K at 120. It's fantastic for that reason. But it has a 12 megapixel sensor. And, oh, Dane, welcome. This has a 12 megapixel sensor, which makes it essentially not unusable for photos, but like if you're doing anything serious with photos, 12 megapixel photos leave you wanting. And so I've got a shoot coming up in a couple weeks that thankfully Dane is going to be a part of, and we need some photos. And it's a situation of like, if it were just me, I'm not equipped to take photos. I don't have a camera that can really take photos other than the 12 megapixel photos of the A7S III. So even the A7 III, which I used to have, was a 24 megapixel camera. Fantastic for stills. I did tons of photos with that for years. Great camera, great sensor. And so that's as I'm thinking like, well, as a second camera, do I just get another A7S III? Yes, that makes two interviews possible, or two camera interviews possible. And I guess the three reasons that I need two cameras are this. One, for two camera interviews, for two camera interviews, so I can have a wide and a tight, or, just two angles. That's one reason that I need two cameras. Another reason I need two cameras is when I'm shooting B-roll. Often if I'm on a gimbal, being quick about shooting wides on a gimbal and then like tights handheld or on a tripod or whatever else, switching on and off of a gimbal takes a lot of time. And depending on the things that I'm shooting, that extra time is really valuable. And especially like doing events and stuff like that I've got, I'm filming with Dane at some camps this summer. It's the kind of thing where it's like, well, I don't want to spend 15 minutes it wouldn't take 15 minutes, but to spend, if they're doing something for an hour, to spend 10 minutes of that switching lenses, rebalancing on a gimbal, it's just time lost, and that's footage lost because of that. And so having two camera bodies would enable you to have one camera one camera mounted on a gimbal with a wide, and another camera that you can pop different lenses on and get a variety of shots. And that for a long time was what I was doing with my two cameras. The catch was I had a good camera and a bad camera, with sort of a best camera and a not best camera. Like when I was shooting with the A7S III and an A7 III, the A7 III just wasn't as good. The footage isn't as good. And so I sort of had to decide, do I want my gimbal footage to be better or my other, tight lens footage to be better? And I always had to choose. And so there's something very tempting about saying, let's get two A7S IIIs, because I can have one that I shoot tight lenses on and different lenses, and one that I can keep mounted on a gimbal. Both of them shooting 4K at 120 and 10-bit 422. Fantastic quality. That's appealing. That has appeal. But it doesn't solve my problem of I need photos. So the three things I need are two camera interviews, flexibility when I'm shooting B-roll to not spend a whole bunch of time switching setups, and the third thing is to be able to shoot photos. I don't do it a ton, but I can't right now, and I find that limiting both in what I can actually deliver to a client and somewhat mentally. Not being able to like do a good high res photo shoot is limiting. I don't really take pictures of my son with my good camera because it's only 12 megapixels. And I get that these are not real problems for a lot of people. But when you're delivering stuff to clients, there are expectations. And I've got a client who's doing a lot of print stuff, and they want stuff that's higher than 12 megapixels. And I understand that. So Dane, thank you for bringing your camera. So of my options, another A7S III solves the problem of not having a good camera and a bad camera as far as autofocus and frame rates are concerned. But it doesn't solve the problem of having a photo camera available. So I also have the A7 IV, the new one. And I know a lot of people, I know the Splice House dudes use the A7 IV as their B cam and for photos. And I know people like it, but I rented it to use in Indianapolis a couple weeks ago, or in the end of April. And I was really disappointed in it. To shoot 4K 60, there's a crop, which I thought those days were behind us. But alas, they are not. But more concerning than that, because I could work around that. I mean, I could switch it in 1080 as long as it still did at the quality I wanted. Having two cameras like that would be fine. It would, for interviews, be great because I wouldn't need the high frame rates. I could shoot 4K at full frame at 30 or 24, not 30. But as I was using it, not even recording internally, I was just streaming the HDMI out of it. It overheated on me twice. And that was like huge red flags to say, like, I don't want this as my B cam. And maybe it was the unit, maybe I had a lemon, but this camera failed me 2 or 3 times by overheating when it wasn't doing anything intense. It was shooting 4K at 24 and sending it straight out the HDMI. And that's not good for me. And so I'm hesitant. Well, while it would solve the problem, it's a fine camera for photos. I think it's like 35 megapixels, so it's or 30 or something. It's more than the 24 of the A7 III. Um, but it's having these video issues, which I know it does video in every way better than the A7 III did. But it still, I feel like, has those limitations. So I'm not into that one, which brings us to the FX3. I guess I zoomed right past, but the FX3 is the A7S III, but it has a different body a little bit, but same guts, same quality, same everything. That's tempting just because it's easier to kit out a little bit because it has 1/4-inch screws all over it and stuff. But I think I would get that at the same time. That one doesn't have a viewfinder. And for me, when I'm shooting outside and stuff like that, I like having the viewfinder. But so the FX3 is sort of it solves the same problems and doesn't solve the same problems as the A7S III. Gives me a great second camera. It does make me choose between a good camera and a not good camera for my two B-roll cameras, but it doesn't do photos. So the A1 is the camera that sort of does all of this, and in some ways makes the A7S III the inferior camera, in spite of being a phenomenal camera. And just switch to Canon. I'll get to that because I know that there's a question about that. But the A1 is a bonkers camera. It's 50 megapixel stills. It is the Sony flagship camera. 50 megapixel stills. It shoots 8K at 24 and 30 frames per second, which, while you wouldn't think that's very useful, like I don't deliver in 8K or anything like that. I don't think I'd shoot an interview in 8K. I don't even know how long it would last before it overheats, if that's a thing. But I rented one and used it in the beginning of April for a thing in Florida. And being able to film like these little clips of B-roll. I was shooting this macro, the macro probe lens inside this fire engine pump. And being able to shoot it in 8K meant that I could like basically crop in even farther with just a crop in post. Like I could increase the zoom by like a factor of 4, which was awesome because just for these little shots, I didn't have to put it in slow motion because I was on a slider anyway. So I just did a real actual slow motion of the slider, filmed at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. And then in post, it matched all my other footage, but I could push in on it so much more. So when I'm doing this push into this channel of this pump, we get the actual push of the camera, and at the same time, I'm zooming in on the footage. So it's way more dramatic than I would have gotten with a 4K shot, maybe twice as dramatic. But that is not something I would use a lot, I don't think. And so that's not a huge draw for me. Like, oh, I can finally shoot 8K. But the fact that it has amazing autofocus and shoots 4K at all the same frequencies and frame rates that this thing shoots at, that's a huge perk. So that gives me a second camera for interviews, a second camera for B-roll, and photos better than any other camera I've used. The problem is that camera is $6,500 for the body. And as I do my math for the money that I make with my day rate, and I'm usually $1,800 all in for a day, I would have to shoot a lot of shoots to pay for that $6,500. That's just a lot of money for a second camera. And so my other two options here are to hire somebody that has a camera. And that's what I've been doing since I've only had one camera. I've just hired somebody that has a camera. I've met a couple people through these YouTube live streams who've come out and filmed with me, and it's been awesome. But I had to shoot a 2-camera interview, and I hired a guy named Chris Bland, who is fantastic to work with, and he brought a camera. And I'm going to Florida to shoot with Dane, and he's bringing 2 cameras. And so that's been my other way around this. Of like, if I need more B-roll, it just makes sense to hire someone with a second camera rather than me doing double duty. And I prefer that more. I like being nimble and being able to shoot things without switching my setup. But really, I think more than with that comes the frantic nature of production, where I'm switching cameras and setups, and I go, let me get this shot with the gimbal. Now let me go back and get it with the other thing. And it produces a different, not quality of footage, but it's a different headspace for the day. and it's more frantic, it's less thoughtful. And when I know that I'm working with somebody, it's like, Dane's going to be wide on the gimbal and I'm going to just be tight, shooting B-roll handheld. And it lets me get so much more thoughtful footage because I'm only focused on this. I'm not focused on switching setups, and I'm not focused on seeing things differently. Like, oh, I need a wide shot. What would that look like? And now I need a tight shot. I just focus on the tights. And it creates a different perspective on the day, which creates, I think, better footage. So that's been the big thing that I've been doing, is just hiring other people. And I'm grateful that I've had the flexibility from my clients and the budgets to do that. And the other option I have is to rent stuff. And I've done that now twice. I rented the A7 IV for Indianapolis, and I rented the A1 for my trip to Florida. And it was awesome. And it cost me a couple $100s, which I passed on to the client. And again, it's the kind of thing where, like, I think it probably cost me like $200 to rent that A1 for the week, maybe $300. And well, no, it definitely wasn't that much. It was not a lot to rent this camera for a week. And I could rent it 20 times before it would be more expensive than just buying it outright. And as I look at my schedule and what's right for me, I think renting it 20 times rather than buying it and having another $6,500 hit the credit card, and then being in a spot where it's like, well, it's sitting in my basement most days of the week, that's not ideal. And that's not a wise use of my money. And so that's where I've come to settle down, to say, I think for the time being, I'm going to rent people whenever I can't rent people. I'm going to hire people whenever I can and rent gear the times that I can't. And if that means I have to pull into my own budget a little bit and chip away at my day rate, spend a little bit of money to rent a camera, that's still better than the investment I would have to take out of my day rate to purchase a new camera. And so as much as I love gear, that's the financially responsible decision. And the cost there is an interesting one. And this is where I was going back and forth. But like I said, I don't have a photo camera. And so if I wanted to do photos, if I wanted to shoot headshots of myself, or, I talk about bird photos and photos of my kid and stuff, but there's also stuff where I want to shoot product photos and I want to practice these things. And there are limitations to what I can do with this stuff when I'm shooting with a 12 megapixel camera. And I feel that. I feel that limitation creatively, and I think I need to instead shift my perspective so that I feel it as a challenge of how can I shoot this differently? How can I combine photos and shoot things so that I can get the most out of being limited to a 12 megapixel camera, which 10 years ago people didn't have anyway. So my solution for the time being is renting, and it's not because any of these cameras isn't the right camera. And that's what when Dane said switch back to Canon, I'm not switching back to Canon. Canon has some decent cameras. They finally started putting focus on mirrorless hybrids that shoot video and stills really well. But for a long time, they didn't. And their autofocus still isn't as good as the Sony's. And they're more expensive, and their glass is way more expensive for most things. And at this point, to sell all my Sony gear and switch to Canon would be cost prohibitive. But also, there's no feature that any Canon camera has right now that is better than any combination of features in a Sony camera. If there was something where, like for a couple months, the 8K that whichever one of the EOS Rs shot was like, oh, wow, they can do 8K. And I know it had the overheating issue, and like I said, I don't care about, I'm not filming in that. But then Sony has 8K now as well. And so there's no like, oh, well, they do slow motion at this. Like, well, Sony does that too. So there's no standout feature of any Canon camera. Maybe the shooting in the Canon Log or Canon Raw Light or whatever. I don't know which ones shoot which. But for what I do, I usually don't shoot in log because the pace that I deliver to clients doesn't afford me the time to color footage. And so like all the stuff that we shot in Indianapolis, all the stuff that we shot in Florida, to spend time coloring all that is time that my clients are usually not willing to pay for. And they would never notice that something was log footage that got colored versus something that was, captured with the color burned in camera. So for that reason, I'm not shooting in raw. I'm not shooting in log even most of the time. The S Cinetone is phenomenal, and that's what I've been using since I've had this camera. And so switching to Canon doesn't make sense for me because it's not a lot better than Sony. And I'm sure you could pick a couple features here and there. It's like, oh, they've got the edge on Sony there, but there's not enough of a draw to justify making the full swap back to Canon from Sony. I like Sony, and I like how focused they've been on customer feedback and how they continue to innovate. And I'm excited for whatever camera's next. And I guess that's another layer of why I don't want to buy a camera at this point, because with the product cycle of all these things, if I were to say, okay, I'm going to save up for a couple months and then buy an A1, how long before the A1 Mark II comes out or whatever, and then I have an not obsolete, but I could have spent the same amount of money if I just waited a few months and gotten an even better camera with more capability. So for me, for the time being, I'm going to stick to my A7S III, and I'm going to hire people when I can who will have other cameras, and I'm going to rent whatever camera is going to be best for the job. Maybe it's a second video camera for doing video-focused camera like the A7S III or the FX3 for more B-roll stuff. Maybe it's a camera like the A7 IV for hybrid, or the A1 if I really need to do some photo-intensive stuff or some high-resolution video. But after a lot of thought and a lot of budgeting, that's where I've ended up, where I'm going to stay with one camera body for the foreseeable future. And if something phenomenal comes out, maybe I'll get rid of this guy and step over to that. Or maybe I'll add that to the arsenal if I just can't live without it. But I can't see that being the case right now or anytime soon. That's all I got. Thanks for watching. I'm excited. I'm in my studio here. You can see it's better lit than it usually is down here, and I have the microphone set up. I set up the cameras down here, and this week I'm going to record a bunch more content, which I'm excited about, including the emotional journey I've gone down wrestling with the shirt that I'm wearing right now. A shirt that I love, a shirt that I believe in wholeheartedly, and it's challenged me in some ways I didn't expect. And I thought, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I wrote a really, really long video today, and it made me think in a different way, and now I want to rewrite it. And so I've got content like that coming up. I've got some stuff about the Sony cameras and settings and stuff, and a gimbal walkthrough, which I'm excited about, which I think will be a really helpful video of sort of what I think are the four, not mistakes, but four things that if you're shooting with a gimbal, these are the four things I see as easy ways to take your footage to a professional level, because I've seen that in my own footage and in people I've worked with, and I've also seen it like on TV, like just bad gimbal footage, and it's to the point now where like I forgot what Jesse and I were watching the other day, but there was a bad gimbal move, and and she's like, was it a bad gimbal move? I'm like, yeah, it was. And so as I've thought about how to combat some of those things, I've got a video on that I'm going to make this week. So thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for hanging out with the live streams, and throwing the comments out there and continuing to be a part of this channel as it slowly grows. And if you've got any thoughts or requests for these Tuesday night streams and topics, I'm usually thinking up one on Tuesday morning and making a thumbnail during nap time and posting it. And so love me some robotic gimbal moves. Oh yeah, get that fake floor in there, walk in the room, and then turn, suddenly start a rotation. There's a bunch of good gimbal moves out there that you can just watch, like House Hunters or any of the HGTV shows. I'm sorry if you're a shooter for them. Their gimbal footage is typically pretty abysmal. So if you want to know how not to shoot it, check out anything in HGTV. And yes, there is going to be a live stream in a couple weeks. I don't know if it's going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but at some point, Dane and I are going to stream live, I think, when we're shooting together somewhere. So stay tuned. Sorry, there's noises down here that took me by surprise. That's all I got. Have a wonderful day, night, whatever, wherever. See you later. Bye. And now that awkward moment to turn off the